set limitations and restrictions on production?
Not necessarily setting limitations, right? So you're right, the command economy is characterized by the public ownership of everything and decisions made through central planning, right? So there's like a planning board that might have production goals or something like that, right? And that's how, you know, things are measured, right? So it'd be like, hey, you know, this region of Russia or something, they need to produce so many shoes per year, right? And that's the way they deal with economic scarcity is the planning board looks at how much leather there is and how much, you know, rubber there is to make the shoes and the soles, and what the need is, you know, in terms of how many people, you know, are coming of age that need work boots, or how many people's old work boots are you know, crappy enough that we need to replace them. And so they try and make some calculation like that and say, you guys need to produce 50,000 shoes this year. Does that make sense? So that's the market system. That's the command economy, right? So the command economy is, let's get rid of this thing. Man, this thing is not focusing today. Much better. So the command economy, this is public ownership, central planning, and production, like goals are production oriented. Goals, production.
Doesn't command government own the markets?
Pardon? So the
like market system had, okay, so public is like government. I figured out, sorry.
No, you're fine. Yeah, so public is like government ownership. Yeah.
I was thinking private.
Right. Yeah. So private ownership is that's the market system, right? So the market system is private ownership. And there's coordination through market prices. So instead of having central planning, we have coordination through market prices. What do we mean by market prices? What was the price in the command system? Whatever the central planning board. They're like, well, shoes are $5 or 5 rubles or whatever the currency is, right? And that's how much shoes should be, and that's how much every shoe in this country is going to be sold for. Otherwise, you know, you're violating the planning board and the central government, right? You would be fined. Now, what have we seen with history? That in command economies there are, you know, illegal black markets, right, where market prices will exist, you know, but it's not by design. But that's just.
Or like even if we think about Britain during World War II, and the government took the majority of their resources and said, "Here's your meal ticket. This is what you got."
Right, right. I mean, in the United States as well, there was rationing of gas. There was, you know, so people were lining up on certain days to get gas depending on your license plate number, and like they stopped making certain things that were made out of metal because they needed that metal to make ships and things like that, you know. So there.
I figured out why they used nylon, why nylons got discontinued. So nylon was created to mimic silk, which is the strongest natural fabric.
Ah.
And nylon is now used to make the majority of parachutes and that kind of material because it's strong
and light.
It's cheap.
And it's light and super light.
So that's why they stopped making nylons during World War II.
Very interesting. I should know that since I really want to be a parajet flyer. You guys know what this is?
In my costume production class. We were talking about textile.
That's awesome. I'll show you when we need a boring break, because this will get boring. We'll take a break and I'll show you a video of what a parajet is. Because I'm going to buy one day and you guys will see me flying around. It'll be awesome. And I should have known about the nylon because I'm sure the parajets are made mostly of nylon. Okay, so instead of production oriented, right, it's a lot of kind of price orientation in a market system. There's individual decisions. for consumption and production. It's easy to, since we've never lived in a command economy, right? It's easy to think that this is kind of the status quo in terms of we can decide what we eat and produce, right? But in these command and these central planning economies, you would get like a bushel of wheat or something, like you would get so much of, rice or beans or maybe a little bit of meat and some vegetables, and that would be, issued by the state essentially as for what you were to consume, right? And so there wasn't as much of a free choice in consumption as well.
So, like in Russia, was there a limit on production that you could do within your own home? Like, could people keep their own vegetable gardens, or? That's
a very good question. I don't know. I'll get back to you. So, so like cottage industries and stuff like that. What was the? Was that allowed? I think as long as you didn't sell it in the market, it was allowed. But I let me double check. Right. Could there be some bartering?
You're good at making shoes, and I'm really good at growing carrots. So can I trade shoes for carrots or not?
I mean, I think you were oftentimes employed in a factory or someplace, so you wouldn't necessarily have the time or the inclination to have that kind of side business or side hustle or something. But let me do some research into it because it's a very good question. And I don't know offhand. All right. So the result of this one is that we have competition, right? That's the main thing. There's competition in a market system, right? The competition is what drives down the prices. It's what drives up the quality, right? And so we saw in the command economy that there wasn't a lot of improvement in goods over time, right? Because essentially, like, as long as you made a shoe that looked like a shoe and functioned like a shoe, then you were going to get paid however much for those 5,000 shoes or whatever that the government told you to produce. If those shoes, if the glue on the shoes came apart in a few weeks, that's not really your problem. There's not, and part of it's because what's somebody going to do? Go to another shoe factory? Like, there is no other shoe factory. We are the shoe factory. And so quality concerns were an issue, and just the lack of improvements, right? So why do people make better goods these days? For more money, right? You want to make something that's better. You want to charge people extra money for it, and you want to steal the market share from somebody else. And so there's kind of a theory that the laissez-faire system creates more competition, which in turn creates more innovation. So that innovation is really the brainchild of competition in a way. Now, it's not to say that if you were in this command economy, you might not come up with inventions or invent something new, but you didn't have as much of an incentive and an ability to really bring that invention or that innovation out to the general public writ large. And so the market system really incentivizes us to find cheaper ways to produce things, find better, more high quality items to produce and sell. And so that the competition and innovation kind of go hand in hand. All right, very good. That was Andrew. All right, how does self-interest, I kind of just talked about this, so never mind, let's skip that. Here we go, this is a good one. Why is private property and the protection of property rights so critical to the success of the market system? Jacob.
Just about the private property and protection of property rights. market system would drive its private ownership. And they could do like their individual choices, and without private property protection, they'd be able to do that. It's just like the main economy, which is public.
What wouldn't they be able to do without the private property protections?
Like the production, maybe, like what they produced.
Well, what? So they could still produce.
Not like choose what they produced. Say like.
They could still choose what to produce. So we're not entirely in the command economy, but if you don't have private property, would you necessarily be willing to like invest in the property? Would you like make sure that everything, would you keep it up over time? Would you add and expand onto the property, right? So investment and innovation don't happen as much. What's a real life example of this that we see right now? What's a place where investment and innovation don't happen as much because of lack of private property protections? Actually, really lack of intellectual property protections, which is a very similar thing, right?
Maybe developing countries or
There's one in particular.
North Korea. Ooh,
No.
South, not South.
China.
That was my fourth.
So this is part of the narrative about China, right? Is that because there's so much IP theft, intellectual property theft, you can't, like, innovating, creating a new invention in China is not as profitable as creating a new invention in Western Europe or the United States or whatever, right? And what's a really illustrative example of this is, remember those stupid hoverboards that were like 4 years ago, and they were like, everybody had one, and they were like lighting on fire and crap, right? Because they were produced really crappily, really like just shady. Well, there was a podcast about trying to figure out who actually invented that. And they like went to China and went to the particular like city where there are all these factories and talked to these like factory owners and stuff. And what they found out was there was no single like author or father of this invention. So these Chinese businessmen would get together after work, and they would kind of just like with the spare parts from their factories of stuff they're already making, like, Roombas and vacuum cleaners and all sorts of stuff, right? They would start like tinkering around to make their own little gizmos. And this was one of the gizmos that they invented was this hoverboard thing. And so it was like 4 or 5 different factory heads that kind of invented it together while they were drinking. And so nobody knows like who was the single author of it, right? And that's part of the reason why there were so many different kinds of them out there. And a lot of them, like I said, would light on fire and stuff like that, right? Because they were essentially made with spare parts from other factory production decisions, right? And so they weren't as able to kind of, get that recoup that investment or earn the profits on that invention, right? Because of the fact that there were so many copycats and there's not a lot of enforcement of, intellectual property, right? And so there's been a lot of talk about, that you're just not incentivized in the same way if you live in China as the United States to come up with an invention because you can't protect it and somebody else is going to come and rip it off and you're not going to be able to make a lot of money for very long. Does that make sense? All right, so
what about like communes stuff? Like, how do those work? Are those command economies? Command economies acting as an independent person in
they're usually not command because there's not so it's usually a bunch of people making the decisions together. So all the people in the commune will have like weekly meetings, and they'll all divide up the different chores and everything like that. and they might elect somebody to be the head or elect a group of people to be kind of a planning board, so to speak. But everybody has ostensibly everybody has a voice and a vote in the process. So I think it's a lot more democratic than the old command economies, because the command economies were really just like, there was a king or there was a lord, and they told everybody what to do, right? And you would essentially, so a lot of command economies were also like blended with traditional economies. So traditional meaning like if your dad was a cobbler, you were a cobbler. If your dad was the mayor, you were going to be the mayor. So like everyone, their firstborn kid would be the replacement for them in this society, right? And so that never quite generated new economic activity or new industries. The market system the command economy often didn't as well, except for maybe generating, new types of military defense and things like that. You know what I mean? As technological advances came along.
I see what I'm doing. I'm confusing like a political system and an economic system. Kind of.
There's not, they are always related.
Yeah.
And so all economic systems have political elements to them and vice versa. So I don't think that's a bad thing. Like economics first started as political economy and then split off into political science and economics as this kind of mathematical subject. But you're not wrong in terms of linking those two. They're very important. And they are very much exceptions to the rule in terms of, they're all kind of operating as a extended family in a way when you think about it. All families are mini communes. You could think about it that way too. Good questions. Yes.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Okay.
please.
So about like the protection of property rights, if there wasn't a legal way to protect something, then you wouldn't be able to negotiate legal contracts. So basically someone who's stronger could take from the weaker person, if we didn't have that in place. So instead you have to agree that you're going to give something to somebody, and it has to be mutually agreeable. So if you want something back that's going to help you, so legally we have to have that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, even in places where there are property rights, oftentimes it takes forever to legislate something, right? I think in India, it's like a decade. So like, think about it, like you've got a business transaction or something, or a lease or whatever, and if you have to go to court, it's going to take 10 years to get that rectified. So those kind of that's what we call institutions, right? It's like, how well does your notion of private property rights and the defense of them work? How good is your institution? So even though there's a lot of bloat and there's a lot of, everybody complain about, we're over litigious in the United States or whatever, we actually have pretty good institutions in terms of, upholding contracts and kind of keeping people and, being able to attach liens and judgments to people's accounts and stuff like that, right? There are some countries where they will, I think it might be China, where you'll lose a lawsuit and you'll have to pay somebody like millions of dollars, and you just won't. And they don't really have a way to like enforce it and like attach it to your home or attach it to your bank account, right? And that's why they're doing this new social credit system, right? Where essentially now so like that happened to some guy where he made some bad business deal and he bought a bunch of like aluminum, and then the price of it's dropped, and then he couldn't sell it, and yada, yada, yada. So he owed all this money, and he got a judgment against him and he couldn't pay the money. And in the old days, they really couldn't do anything. And now they put him on this list so that when he calls anybody, at the beginning of him calling them, it says like, this person is on the socially undesirable list. Like, you should tell them to pay your bills. And he can't get airline flights. He has to take train travel everywhere. So they're really like trying to crack down on it and like get rid of a lot of what they consider luxuries. Disallow the use of luxuries for these citizens that are in arrears, right? That are owing all this money. But devil's advocate, in his defense, how is he supposed to make up the money if he can't, travel for business on planes and things like that? You know what I mean? Because the train travel takes significantly longer than flights and yada, yada, yada. So there's arguments on both sides, but absolutely, like, private property contracts, they're all linked together. Very good. And this encourages people to cooperate and make mutually agreeable economic transactions, right? So mutually agreeable economic transactions. So what are the advantages of using capital in the production process?
Makes it easier.
How does it make it easier?
Your capital needs to be like tools and resources that makes connections happen faster.
Very good. Increase efficiency. What about the division of labor? What do we mean by division of labor? Oh, can't see. Yeah.
It means basically that work is performed, tasks that are best suited for their individual abilities.
Very good.
Specializations.
What's your name?
Kaylin.
Kaylin, thank you. All right. What problems, so I guess I should ask this question earlier. I should change colors. What problems does barter entail? Why is barter problematic?
That's the coincidence thing, isn't it?
Very good. The coincidence of two wants, or sorry, double coincidence. So if someone wants something, he or she will have to find someone who wishes both to part with the good that they want and is willing to accept the thing that the first party wishes to part with, right? So you have to find somebody that both, so say I need a car, but all I have is a saddle. I need to find somebody who's willing to trade. They need a saddle for their horse and they don't need this extra car anymore. Or they bought a new car, so I have to wait for this double coincidence of wants. Right? And so we can use money as a medium of exchange, right? Instead, use money as a medium of exchange. So how would we all get paid if we didn't have money? We would get paid with essentially part of what we produce, right? So if you worked at a factory making wrenches, they would pay you in a bunch of wrenches and you'd have to go out and sell those wrenches, right? Or they'd pay you in a bunch of food at the restaurant and you'd have to live off that food / sell that food. It just doesn't work, right? So money, it's very convenient. We've used money in one way or another for thousands of years. There are trees where they would put notches on the trees as a way of money. There are societies that use giant wheels of cheese as money. There's all sorts of things used as money over time. But essentially, money itself has the value only of what it can buy. So money is not inherently valuable. Even gold, right? Gold, everyone talks about, oh, we should return to a gold standard or whatever. But, there's not, there are some uses for gold in terms of jewelry, and there's uses for gold in computers and things like that, right? But it's so tiny compared to how much gold there is. So it would just be another, it would just be another placeholder, if we had gold instead of money. And it would be really difficult for us to deal with recessions and expansions and things like that. So we'll get to that later on in the class. Question. I'm trying to figure out because I want to make sure we get to notes today. What is meant by creative destruction? Let's jump to that one. What is meant by creative destruction?
Isn't it like when you innovate so much that traditional older ways just kind of part because everyone's trying to stay future focused, I guess?
So you innovate so much that old inventions are useless now, become useless. So it's how, the technical is how new products and production destroy the market positions of firms. What do we mean by market positions of firms?
There's less people buying from them, like their desirability is down.
Right.
Everyone wants to-
So who here remembers Palm Pilots or Handspring? Two amazing companies that looked like they were gonna, just do awesome things, and then they just got completely destroyed by BlackBerry. And then iPhone came along, which was it's essentially the same thing as a Palm Pilot, and just completely destroyed them. And so nobody has, Palm Pilots or anything like that anymore, even though they were awesome and they were like the start of a personal device, right? PDAs, they were called PDAs. Same thing with, the MP3, yeah, exactly, records and 8-tracks or MP3s and tape decks and things like that, right? And you can think about Blu-rays being destroyed by 4K, right? Who wants a Blu-ray anymore? That's crappy quality. You need a 4K now. And this happens a lot. This term was coined by a guy named Joseph Schumpeter, but it really just it's really indicative of the constant change and the churning that happens within our worlds, So I talked to you guys a little bit last time about, the Luddites and things like that, right? And so there's creative destruction when the loom was created, and when people stopped creating all this stuff in cottages and going to factories. There's creative destruction when the automobile put carriage drivers and things like that out of work.
Because slowly our clothes are being just turned into for the wash.
Right.
No one wants to pay to dry clean.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a very good point. And the internet with travel agents, right? Like they don't exist anymore because you can just do it all yourself. Okay, awesome. Ooh, that's a good one. Describe in a sentence what's the meaning of the invisible hand. Brock.
Isn't it like the invisible hand? It's like you don't realize you need something, but it comes.
Kind of. It's talking about how. So it's about market prices. So market prices are an invisible hand. You want to take another stab? Market prices. What do they do? So if the price of something is really high, then it must be scarce, right? And if it's really low, then it must be, really, really common and everywhere. And so the market prices are the invisible hand that's guiding or coordinating the economy. Sorry, that should say economy, but I can't write. Guiding / coordinating the economy by rationing what is scarce. I figured a better way to do this. By rationing what is scarce and providing incentives to produce the most desired goods and services. Goods and services, we're going to write a lot in this class, so let's just start abbreviating it with G and S. So, essentially why would you get into a certain field, or why would you start, producing a certain crop and selling it, right? You're incentivized by the high price in the market for that crop. So we think of the prices as the invisible hand, right? What in the command economy, was there an invisible hand? No invisible hand, because there weren't really prices, right? I mean, there were, but they weren't market prices. They're not determined by the supply and demand forces. It was just the central planning board being like, shoes are $5, deal with it. And so now the market prices are going to make it so all of a sudden, shoes are $9 or $130. And so you're incentivized to, open a shoe factory and start selling shoes, because it only costs $20 to make the shoe and everybody's paying $130 for the shoe. And so that's a ton of value added, right? Now, shoe companies end up spending a horrendous amount of money on advertising and paying celebrity endorsements and paying influencers and everything like that, right? But they still make a crap ton of money. Like, our shoes are still way overpriced compared to what it costs to make them. And so that's why we have so many shoe companies. And so it helps us not just in producing, but also rationing, what's scarce. And so say you were say you wanted to make something, but there wasn't enough of an input, so you like the high price of that input would deter you from entering that industry. And so in a way, it's rationing what's scarce, right? Because the price of that good is just going to be too high. It's not going to make economic sense. Yeah.
So that applies more to like the companies producing things than it is. It's like.
Right. Yes. This is more from the firm side rather than from the individual side. I mean, we could think of this though as like, why do we pick the jobs that we pick? Nah, never mind. Just think about it like from the firm side. Yeah. It's a stretch to try and extend it to the consumer. Good question. All right, and then that one's done. We'll do this one. What are the major forms of household income? So how do households make their cheddar? And household, we're just going to abbreviate with HH, household income. And so I'll just answer this for you guys. From largest to smallest, we've got 71% is wages and salaries. Corporate profits are 14%.
So
That would be you own stock in it, or you own a bond, and that it pays out to you. So yeah, that would be investment income essentially. Then we have proprietor's income. So if you own a business yourself, that's 9% of the total income. Income. And then we've got interest income. So this is, if you just put it in a savings account or a CD or bought a 10-year treasury bill or something, right? That doesn't have to do with corporations, but you're still earning interest. So that's usually from a bank. And then rents, 1% rents. So what do we see? We see that wages and salaries generate 3 times more income than profits.
Life is just if I'm not doing something else, right?
Exactly.
Does the corporate profits that like consider like
Yes. And so a lot of this 14% is, you know, people's retirement account. All right, cool. Let's move on to, do we have any other questions on chapter 2 before we move on to chapter 3? Any questions on the circular flow? It's pretty simple. There's not a lot I can ask about it anyways. All right, awesome. Moving on. So let's see, let's define a market. So one market defined. Chapter 3, yeah, sorry. This is going to be A. And so our definition is a market. If a 3 equal sign means definition, is defined as an institution or mechanism that brings buyers and sellers together. Yeah. So the first markets were actually like in France during the feudal era. And so like it was still feudal, it was still this command economy, right? But there were like traveling artisans and stuff like that. And those people would get together, essentially have like a festival. And that would be, those were some of the first markets that we ever really saw. So it could be local, national, or international. So it's pretty easy to talk about international and national markets these days, right? You know, international market, you know, could be for video games, right? National market could be for, you know, television programming, or trying to think of something else that's kind of US focused. I mean, so many markets are international, right? Local markets would be, you know, farmers markets and things like that. Yeah, sale barns. Like, but the problem is a lot of our local markets, you know, because of the internet, they have an international reach. You know what I mean? So these are all a bit more overlapping than they used to be, I would say. Some markets are highly personal, face-to-face. Highly personal. Yeah.
So let's say you like own like a small boutique like in town, but then you have a website. Does that then make it international at the point where it's on the internet, or?
I mean, I guess at the end of the day, it would depend on how much international commerce are you really doing. You know, like, are you selling a lot of stuff internationally? Are you getting a lot of, you know, penetration internationally? So yeah, I would say look at your sales to try and determine it. I'd say most people are probably more towards the local end of it. You know what I mean? And yeah, so it just has to do with the composition of your sales rather than the theoretical reach that you could have. That's how I would measure it.
So back to my question, we were talking about an open air fabric market in the LA
Uh-huh.
and she was telling us how to burn test fabric. But like, would that be considered a local or an international? Because there's French silk, there's Chinese silk, there's this, that, and the other from everywhere in the world being brought. Like, is that a local market or is it an international? Because it is being sold face to face.
Right. In one spot. I mean, I would say I would say in our definition here, it's a local market. But I don't know, because LA is like the international hotspot for fashion. So you probably have people from Japan and people, you know what I mean? So maybe international. Yeah, I would probably say international at that point. And it's not necessarily because of the composition of the goods that are international, but the fact that the people that are going there and buying are international, you know? Like I had the privilege to go to a pre-SHOT Show. And so a SHOT Show is like a military weapon arms expo. And I got to go to the essentially like the firing round demonstration beforehand. So I got to shoot like sniper rifles and automatic stuff and a grenade launcher. It was so cool. It was so cool. And that was absolutely an international market. You know, there were people from other countries, there were government officials from other countries, you know, there was our government there, you know, and so that when I think of international market, I think of something like that, or like Lord of War, you know, the arms bazaar and the arms conventions. And Lord, if you guys have ever seen that movie, it's a really good movie with Nicolas Cage back in the day.
So when you have international sellers, you probably have international designers through this market.
Exactly. And so that's why I think it's the international buyers, the international, that's what makes it, not necessarily. Because I mean, otherwise, you know, there's places in Denver that, like, I think it's called World Goods or something, right? Where you can buy all sorts of stuff from all around. And that's like their whole shtick is that we have all this stuff from everywhere, you know, but I'd still consider that like a local or a national market. Probably national because there's many chains of it all around the United States, you know, so I consider that a national market.
Probably crossbreed more local and national.
Right, right. And so the main thing, one of the main things is the fact that there's a large number of buyers and sellers, okay, and they're independent. So large number of independent buyers and sellers. So the buyers and sellers aren't joining up into groups and you know, getting together, right? There's a lot of independent sellers and a lot of independent buyers in these markets. And then we can really differentiate between, so what would this be? I guess this is 4. We can differentiate between product markets, which sell goods and services. And then we have resource markets, which involve factors of production. So, you know, our land, labor, capital, you know, so selling coal, selling diamonds, selling all this other kind of stuff, those are in resource markets before they hit product markets. Any questions on markets? Awesome. Good questions so far, guys. Keep them up. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. So product markets and resource markets. Essentially, yeah. I mean, unless, you know, like you're buying wood for your home, then you're. So now we're going to jump into demand. So let's just first off draw our first graph. And we've got price on the y-axis and Q on the x-axis. If you ever forget, you can use the alphabet. LMNOPQRS, right? The P comes before the Q in the alphabet. The P comes to the left of the Q when you're labeling. There's been many times where I've switched these. So I need mnemonics. Mnemonics help me a lot. All right. And then the other nice thing is that when we're talking about demand, it's always going to be downward sloping. So the demand curve is downward sloping. And so why is that? Well, at lower prices, right? So if the price of a latte is $9, then there's only going to be like 2 people that are going to want it any given day, right? Because they're just coffee addicts and they need their coffee. It doesn't matter how much it is, or they own half of Chadron, so they're like, whatever, I don't care how much a coffee is, I need my latte. But most of us are going to be like, that's way too expensive, right? And then as the price decreases to something more reasonable, like $5, then there's going to be more demand, right? Then there's going to be maybe 15 people every day that are consuming a latte. And if the price of lattes jumps down to like $2 for some reason, right? Then there's going to be a whole bunch of people that are going to want it. This could be 25 or something. So if you're ever having trouble trying to figure out which one is demand and which one's supply, just look at which one's downward sloping. Or you can also just do a little example and say, well, does it make sense that if the price decreases, my quantity that's demanded is going to increase? Yeah, that makes sense. That's the way that I react to stuff, right? If all of a sudden your favorite, snack at Walmart is half as much, you're going to buy more. You're going to stock up on it if you can, And so that's this whole behavior essentially. As things get cheaper, more people are going to buy them. Ceteris paribus. So I should explain what that means. That's probably the last thing we'll do today. Ceteris paribus. This is Latin for all else equal. Why don't we just say all else equal? I don't know. That'd make it too easy on you guys. So the economists end up saying ceteris paribus a lot. And what that means is just that essentially the only thing that's changing is the price. So that means the weather's not changing. That means the quality of the product's not changing. That means your income isn't changing. That means the price of substitutes or complements isn't changing, right? Because, say the price of your favorite bread goes down to 50 cents. If all the other breads in the bread aisle go down to 25 cents, you're probably not going to buy your favorite bread for 50 cents. You're going to buy 2 loaves of the really cheap, the other bread for 25 cents each, right? And so there's a lot of there's a lot of moving parts in the economy, right? And so we have to simplify and say nothing else is changing. The only thing that's changing is the price of a latte in this particular example. So the price of tea isn't changing because that's a substitute for lattes, right? The price of caffeine pills isn't changing or whatever, Not that you guys should do those. Those are terrible for you. But I'm just trying to think of substitutes, Your income isn't changing. The weather, like people demand more coffee and stuff like that in the winter. People demand more ice cream in the winter, even though you think it's summer. So this is an important thing that we're going to see time and time again in terms of all else equal. We just want one thing to change so that we can effectively, you know, at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to model what's going on in the market for lattes so that we can make some decisions about, you know, planning for the future in terms of how much, you know, what the price of lattes is going to be like in the future and what the demand's going to be like. You know, is there enough of a market demand for me to open another coffee shop in this town or not, right? Those are the kind of things that we're going to be modeling. We'll use these graphs to model those. But right now we just gotta think about just if one thing changes and everything else stays equal, that's really the name of the game for most of this class. Okay? All right, we'll pick up here on Thursday. Let me just make sure. So Kayla is still sick. Lydia, are you here?
I'm right.
Okay, sweet. I didn't call on you. Drew? Okay. You talked. Alyssa talked. Ayla Lopez? Still not here? Okay. Kayla's here. Kaylee? Okay, sweet. And Brock. Awesome. Cool. Got everybody. I'll update your attendance today too. Try and keep on top of that. I like the hat.
My grandfather's.
That's awesome.